Well, first I want to thank Christian for the opportunity to actually have this reflective moment. I thought it was a really brilliant idea to take the opportunity on the 25th anniversary to go all the way back and think about kind of how all of us started thinking about Rwanda, how we ended up there in the first place. And so much like my colleagues, I think I'm actually going to start with how I ended up in Rwanda in the first place. So I originally went to Rwanda in 2004 for the 10th anniversary of the genocide, and I was involved in a project that worked on the construction of the National Genocide Memorial in Gisozi. So many of you will have visited or be familiar with the project, but originally it was a building that had been built by the mayor of Kigali, and it was being used as a site for the kind of keeping at that time of remains that people had excavated during the reconstruction of Kigali. People didn't really know what to do with them, so they designated a site in this area of town called Gisozi in which the bones were being placed. It was not until a group from the UK called Aegis Trust came and kind of presented a plan for a larger memorialization that the museum actually got kicked off. And I was part of the crew from the very beginning, so we did everything from memorial gardens to the creation of mass grave sites, and my personal project up on the hill there was the creation of a documentation center. So as part of that effort, I was in charge of keeping and collecting all of the information that was being brought by families to the memorial. And this included everything from personal artifacts to photos to stories. And there were some fits and starts on that project, but ultimately we created a library and a small database of the information that was collected. Mostly what is in the documentation center now is the information that was collected to actually build the memorial and the museum. Just so that we can put things in context, I was quite young at the time. And I won't go as far as to say naive, but certainly was part of what I believe to be a project that was about restoring Rwandan civil society, reconciling in some ways the atrocities of the past. And I reflected much more on those aspects of it, I think, than I did some of the more critical aspects that I'll talk about later in the talk. And so for me, coming out of that experience, I then pursued graduate work with this very clear eye to thinking about this concept of healing or reconciliation following atrocity crimes. I was very taken by a lot of the stories that people brought to the memorial, the way in which the museum and the memorial was kind of taken up by certain members of society, the way in which people chose to exhume the graves of their loved ones that they had buried, the remains they had buried in their own backyards, and instead bring them to the memorial, right? They saw this as kind of a broader project, a more lasting legacy. And I was very taken by that. But it wasn't until later when I actually started doing this research that the kind of questions I was interested in started to change. I became less interested in this broader concept of healing and reconciliation, but drilled down instead on thinking about people's lived experiences with conflict and then how that interacted with these post-conflict issues. Particularly, I was interested in post-conflict justice or Kachacha process, which I'll talk about. But the way in which people experience the conflict, I saw as directly shaping these issues of post-conflict justice. My focus on post-conflict justice came from a relatively personal conversation that I had at a dinner party with then Senator Odette Nyiramilimo. And I was going back to grad school, and I said, if there was one question that you had, right, that you would want to ask in some sort of academic research, what would it be? And her question was, is Kachacha going to work? Right, and this was right in that moment in 2004, 2005, where Kachacha was really kind of ramping up. And there was a question within Parliament, just within Rwandan civil society in general, like, is this going to work? And I think Jens will speak to this later. We've gotten much more negative on Kachacha in the last decade, I think. But it's worth remembering that at the beginning of the process, there were people that were really genuinely committed to the project from a reconciliation perspective. Right? There absolutely were people who saw this as an essential way forward in terms of addressing some of the grievances that they saw as leading to cyclical violence in the country. It wasn't until I got into that research that I then really turned my focus to what I believe to be different sites of missing narratives in the Rwanda story. And I think about this pretty broadly, right? There's a variety of different ways I think about and conceive missing narratives, but there are a number of people and stories and places that we miss in our stories about Rwanda. And so for me, my kind of contemporary research question really focuses on who are we missing, but more importantly, why? Why are those stories no longer being accounted for or were never accounted for in the first place? So I went back to Rwanda in 2009, specifically for a project on Kachacha. It was part of my dissertation research, and I interviewed 40 people in 4 different research sites, so 10 people per research site, and did in-depth, semi-structured interviews on people's experiences both with the conflict and then how they were interacting with the Kachacha process. I should assume passing familiarity with Kachacha, right? Okay, perfect. So very interested in people's experience with the Kachacha process. I was less interested in the Kachacha courts themselves, right? That I left as kind of a black box for other scholars that were working really in depth on how that process was functioning and how it was developed. But I was interested more in just kind of what people thought or how they saw the process. And I got some of your kind of basic responses. So respondents that said things like, you know, I saw it as a way that the Rwandan people would be reconciled, right? This was pretty consistent with the contemporary narrative at the time. There were people who were interested in using Kachacha as a way to understand in more depth what actually happened in 1994, particularly younger members of society who had been quite young during the genocide or perhaps hadn't been born at all. They saw Kachacha as an information gathering and information disseminating mechanism. Again, this is pretty consistent with the transitional justice literature as to what Kachacha was supposed to be doing. But for me, there was a decent chunk of my interviews that then gave me other sorts of ways to think about Kachacha. So in particular, this one woman is saying, look, I can't even speak about what happened to me in Kachacha, right? What I suffered was very low level to what other people are suffering, and so there's no place for my narrative in the Kachacha process. She references people who got HIV and were still suffering after the genocide, and so she then says there's no reason that I should talk, right? There's nothing for me to say here that actually applies to my life experience. And probably more perniciously, I was struck by respondents that said things like, well, I actually had very egregious things happen to me during the conflict, during the genocide, but it isn't actually related to the genocide, right? And Kachacha is only focused on genocide crimes. So this particular individual said, you know, who do I accuse, right? Who should I even stand up to and bring forward in Kachacha, except maybe the state, haha, right? And these were the respondents that really piqued my attention, because these were people that that on my kind of conflict indicator, which is one of the things I was asking in these interviews, did you experience the death of a loved one? Did you experience physical violations against yourself? Did you have property destroyed? We're answering yes to all these questions, but from different periods of time, right? These were people who had lost loved ones or experienced violence themselves during the Civil War, or increasingly important for me, people who had experienced these violations during the Abichengazi period or the period immediately following the genocide, where the RPF government was really working to eradicate kind of terrorist elements or what they saw to be existing threats, mostly coming from Congo, but from either former Interahamwe or ex-FAR at the time. So these individuals, in many ways, had the same grievances that people who experienced genocide crimes had, but less of the support from the state, less of the support from the Kachacha process in actually thinking through and processing that. So it was these folks that really got me nervous, right? Got me worrying about things like the actual ability of Kachacha to stop some of these cyclical patterns, thinking about things like political participation going forward, and also thinking about new grievances and new resentments that were potentially being created through this reconciliation process. I put this up only because from a graduate student perspective, it's kind of my funny causal diagram for my dissertation, and so it's worth thinking about. I haven't come back to revisit it in a more sophisticated way, but I still put it up. Christian will be familiar with it nonetheless, right? And this is how I started thinking about what I was hearing in those interviews, right? You have some space that is all lived experiences in a conflict, and this is an incredibly diverse and disparate and dynamic space, and all sorts of people can experience all sorts of types of violence, right? This is the Stathis Kalivas argument. Of just lots of messy stuff goes on during conflict. And then we have some sort of more thick understanding of what a conflict is that generally is imposed after the violence has ended, right? We start to define what actually went on during the conflict. In Rwanda, this is a focus on the genocide, but also, just to a lesser extent, a focus on the Civil War, right? The RPF narrative certainly includes the victory of the RPF and things like that. And then somewhere within this conflict frame, we then have what a post-conflict justice institution is going to choose to focus on. Now, this diagram is important in thinking through, we should never expect a post-conflict or transitional justice institution to account for all violations that happen during a conflict, right? That would just be an unrealistic expectation, because conflicts are so messy and there's so many different things going on. But for me, these kind of pluses and minuses became a really important variation, because there were individuals in Rwanda whose lived experience with the conflict was being captured by the Kachacha process, was being addressed. Jens will talk about things outside of the Kachacha process, right? So we can think about things even like reparation payments, school fees, the reconstruction of housing, all of which was provided to genocide survivors from the Rwandan state, not to mention the NGO support that many of these survivors received. So in some ways, because their experience was consistent with the existing narrative, they were doing better, right? And I hesitate to kind of use any sort of positional language there, but they had support and services that were being provided to them in some way. But then there were individuals in Rwanda whose experiences were outside this narrative for a variety of different reasons, and they had less access to these services that were being provided by the state and the international community. And more importantly, for my research, they were aware of that, right? So they could position themselves according to what they had experienced and whether or not it was a valid narrative or distinction from the state. So then from there, right, we can start to ask the question of, all right, well, how does the conflict get constructed? I was less interested in that, but I was interested in this, why Kachacha, right? So how do we end up with a post-conflict justice institution that's focusing exclusively on that? And we have kind of the common wisdom. And the common wisdom many of you will be familiar with is, well, there was this massive event of violence, and so we needed justice to be brought to bear on everything that happened during the genocide. So we needed a more creative process. This couldn't just be prosecutions, right? This had to be something more dynamic because the genocide itself was just so pernicious. It was so widespread. It was so big. The extraordinary number of perpetrators also called us to think about a different type of process. Again, there were just tens of thousands, what ended up being hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million, depending on what number you pay attention to, people who were involved in this genocide. And so again, we couldn't use just conventional trials or a war crimes tribunal or any of our more conventional forms to deal with these crimes. There was a weak legal system at the time in Rwanda. This was a pretty strong narrative in 94, 95, 96, when people were talking about what to do. And this was to some extent true, right? Lawyers had been killed, had fled the country, and there was a weak legal system that was pretty beholden to the state before the genocide even happened. And then we also had this period of decimated infrastructure, right? So the physical structures weren't even in place, court systems, functioning police units and things like that to do something normal, right? Whatever a normal response from a legal perspective would be. But there were also some alternative explanations that I've begun to develop in my own work. I would also put Luke and Jens's work in this category as well. So one of the things that's always struck with me is this broad definition of genocide. So you really only get to the number of 1.7 or 1.8 million perpetrators if you define genocide incredibly broadly. And the Rwandan state has in fact done that. So they define genocide to include things like property crimes. That's not always a typical response from a post-conflict justice perspective, right? So when we talk about that incredibly high number of perpetrators, we're not talking about people who killed people or were actively implicit in other acts of violence. We get to that huge number of perpetrators by thinking about things like telling on people, right? So when the Interahamwe would come through town and you would point out that somebody was a Tutsi or somebody had in some way betrayed the state, right? That would put you in a perpetrator category. Stealing of personal property once the conflict had happened. So again, these kind of low-level acts of violence that we know happen in periods of armed conflict got lumped not as civil war crimes or crimes of violence or even just deviant behavior, but instead got labeled as genocide crimes. Kachacha also focuses on the genocide over other war crimes. So Kachacha is very explicit in its mandate. It focuses on crimes that took place in the genocide against the Tutsi. It doesn't look at other types of violence that happened during the war. Now, I will say, just as a two-finger, there's been some interesting cases of variation within the Kachacha process, right? So these kind of areas of resistance where individuals have been able to bring more war crime-related charges before the Kachacha courts, but this is incredibly uncommon, right? These are sites of resistance. These are not actual patterns. And so if you lost a member during the Civil War that was killed either by the government or the RPF, right, that a member of your family, then you would still not be eligible for the same sort of justice provisions that Kachacha is offering to other folks. And then there was this insistence on this Rwanda-only process. There was a number of reasons that this narrative came about. The RPF felt incredibly betrayed after the international community's response to the genocide. There was also an incredible focus on self-reliance, again, after the betrayal of the French. And so the kind of governmental focus was on this Rwanda-only process. So when you could think about relaxing that assumption a little bit, if you were more willing to work with the international community, then some of the issues on the common wisdom, right, the weak legal system, the decimated infrastructure, may have been less of a problem at the time. But because of these kind of three core insistences, this is how, some of the foundations for how we end up with the Kachacha process. A lot of the research that I based this on was some work that I did in 2014, so 2009 through 2014, in talking to members of the RPF who were actually involved in this decision in the first place. So some of the founders of the Kachacha process talk about these kind of constraining assumptions that existed at the time, and not necessarily constraining in a negative term, right? These were our core founding principles when we started to think about Kachacha. Jesse, I've frozen. Perfect, I'm back. All right, and then from there, I started to develop a slightly more critical understanding of where those three core assumptions lead us. And this kind of broadens my research outside of a focus only on Kachacha to thinking about transitional justice more broadly. There's been a lot of critical literature in the transitional justice studies realm, and we've started to think about why we are ending up with some of the negative consequences of transitional justice that we're ending up with. So it's not simply that transitional justice processes aren't working, but we're starting to find the ways in which states and governments are manipulating these processes to have different ends or different outcomes. I actually use a theoretical framework of thinking about political order, and one of the neat things about a transitional justice process is that it's pretty value neutral, right? It can be used for positive ends, it can be used for negative ends. It's just an institution, right? So we don't need to assume any sort of normative baggage with the institution just because it's purported to deal with things like reconciliation or justice. Matter of fact, transitional justice is really well suited to advance the three aims of our understanding of political order. So first, it can address security challenges. Transitional justice does this by identifying people who are in violation in some ways of state policies or norms, and it can remove those people from the field of play, particularly when you think about things like trials or exiles or lustration or purging processes. These are ways in which transitional justice can identify people who have committed wrongdoings and then remove them entirely. So from a state building or a post-conflict political order perspective, transitional justice can be incredibly useful in identifying and removing those deviants. Transitional justice also provides material incentives. We think about things like reparation payments. So there are goods that you can, public goods that you can provide, and even private goods through a transitional justice process, which is one of the things that a post-conflict state that's looking to consolidate would be more likely to do. And then last but certainly not least, probably the most effective thing that a transitional justice process can do is help to construct but then also legitimize a political narrative. I want to be a little careful with this because increasingly people have been talking about the creation and legitimation of political narratives as being a bad thing. I don't think it is necessarily a bad thing. States do this all the time, right? We have a lot of nation building or the construction of nation building narratives, and I think they're very important in a post-conflict period. My interest and concern about these narratives comes a few slides back when we're talking about people's experiences who are excluded from those narratives and then the future implications that exclusion will have on some of the political outcomes that we're most interested in. So we can think about this in terms of Kachacha, but we can also think about this as helping understand the rise of transitional justice processes in the kind of post-ICC period. There's been a lot of work, such as Catherine Sicking's work, on the kind of transitional justice cascade, right? This normative explosion of the use of these processes. Well, one of the ways to think about that is that justice actually is cascading, right? There is this normative moment in which people are much more concerned about justice and the rule of law. An alternative way to think about this is that many different types of states have just identified transitional justice as a useful institution that is supported and legitimized by the international community for certain intellectual aims, right? Or in this case, state building aims around the issue of political order. So I take a less normative, norm cascading sort of way of thinking about transitional justice, but rather the rational kind of utility of these processes. I also wanted to highlight some work that Christian and Priyam Trivardi and I have been working on the use of Kachacha. So this is kind of a return for me away from the transitional justice literature to an understanding of Kachacha. And actually, interestingly, this is what I had hoped to do during my dissertation a little while ago and was unable to do because the Kachacha data had never been released. It still has not been released, but Christian and Priyam are smarter than me and were able to use all sorts of computational techniques to get us at some data on Kachacha that allowed us to test some of these questions. So there's a debate in the Kachacha literature about whether or not Kachacha is used purely for prosecutions, right, in a transitional justice perspective. So Kachacha is being used just as this kind of legal rule of law reconciliation tool for prosecuting people who committed crimes of genocide, or if rather we take this more skeptical, cynical aim, transitional justice is being used to punish people and to control people who were deviating, who were not as supportive to the RPF government during the genocide. And so there are these two main kind of arguments that come out in the Kachacha literature. The first is this prosecution argument, and the second is this persecution argument, or this punishment argument. And so Christian, Priyam, and I were able to leverage the Kachacha data to actually empirically test this. So what would that look like from an empirical perspective? Well, if we believe in the prosecution argument, then what we'd expect to see is that areas that have high levels of genocide violence should have high levels of Kachacha prosecutions, right? Because if wrongdoings were committed, people should be tried for those wrongdoings. If we believe in the punishment argument, then we'd empirically expect to see that we would see the highest level of Kachacha prosecutions in areas where there was some sort of challenge to the Rwandan government or the RPF at the time, right? So places that were notoriously Hutu strongholds or areas where there was a lot of resistance to the RPF taking power. If we're really believing this purely political consolidation kind of punishment narrative, then those are the areas where we should see the highest level of prosecutions. And so we test these things, and actually we find that neither of them are the case. So first, it's interesting that the prosecution narrative doesn't hold, right? So we don't actually see the highest, we don't see a one-for-one correlation between genocide crimes and Kachacha prosecutions. We also don't see a particularly high correlation between former Habyarimana strongholds or areas where the RPF should be concerned about political loyalty and Kachacha prosecutions. What we find is actually a third category, which we call persecutions. I'll actually put up just our predicted probabilities here. But in the predicted margins, what you can see is that the strongest predictor that we find of Kachacha prosecutions are unmarried young Hutu men. So rather than thinking about Kachacha prosecutions as a punishment, we actually see, very similar, I think, to some of the arguments that Jens and Luke are making, that Kachacha is actually used as a preemptive tool for social control in areas where there's a potential for a youth bulge, places where individuals could be threatening to the Rwandan state. Now, to be clear, it's not these young men that are actually getting prosecuted, right? So the young Hutu, unmarried young Hutu men don't end up in prison. There's just a higher level of Kachacha activity in those areas, suggesting to us at least that this becomes a pretty pernicious show of state strength, right? So the Rwandan government is coming into these communes in order to demonstrate the ability of the state to hold people accountable. So we're still working on that. That is forthcoming, but let me just preview that that is what we find, and should be, I don't know, out in a journal near you in a couple of months-ish. Christian also asked me to kind of close by thinking about, based on my research and my experience, what we know and what we don't know. I think we know and don't know a lot of things about Rwanda, but I wanted to specifically focus on some of the transitional justice and Kachacha work that I've done. I think what we know, and we're all pretty comfortable with, is that there's been some pretty significant overreach in the case of Kachacha. A lot of people have gotten caught up in that system, for better or for worse, but it got way bigger than anybody, including the Rwandan government, thought it was going to be. And I think we've all accepted the exclusionary nature of Kachacha. I don't think anybody's challenging that. There's all sorts of reasons that people give as to why Kachacha should only focus on genocide crimes. And if you think about genocide as the greatest crime known to man, it is quite possible that maybe it should only focus on genocide crimes, right? We can have that discussion. But I think we're all pretty confident with that statement. I think we're also pretty confident that the RPF has been increasingly using programs of social control and political consolidation since the kind of post-2000s period. Even members within the RPF government are willing to acknowledge that they're engaged in a state-building enterprise that is consolidating political power. The rationale for the use of those programs will differ across individuals, right? So some people are making the argument that those are essential programs to prevent the resumption of genocide. But I think everybody would agree that there are these programs in place. And I think we've all come to understand that there is definitely a suppression of counter-narratives or counter-conflict narratives beyond the genocide. So this we can see most clearly in the redefinition or reterming of the 1994 genocide to the 1994 genocide against the Hutu. So those of us who have been doing work in Rwanda since the early 2000s remember when it was called and commemorated as the genocide, right, or the 1994 genocide. We spoke a lot at that time about the genocide against the Hutu and against the Tutsi and Hutu political moderates. That Hutu political moderates always came up, right? That was a phrase that we were very comfortable using and tacking on to the end of our discussions of genocide. That has gone away now, right? And now it's very clear that the rebranding of these memorials have focused exclusively on the death of Tutsi. And people who are unable to be categorized as Tutsi in relation to the genocide have been written out and are increasingly excluded from the counter-narrative. There are some small exceptions to that when we think about things like Hero Day, where there's a little bit more of a focus on Hutus that aided survivors of the genocide, right, that were rescuers. But for the most part, those stories have been written almost exclusively out of the narrative. And I think we all agree with that, right? I think there's been some even physical changes in the renaming of memorials and things like that to reflect those findings. I think for me, some of the unknown questions are the future stuff. So I still haven't gotten enough leverage in my own research and my own thinking about the impact of these exclusionary transitional justice processes on some of the outcomes that political scientists are particularly concerned about. So I'm very interested in political participation. This is hard to test in Rwanda because there is such high levels of political turnout that there's not a lot of variation across conflict experience and political turnout. And things like participating in civil service, mandated civil service programs, participating in Kachacha. We see a little bit of variation there, but these things are all mandated by an incredibly strong state. So there's not a lot of variation in who actually turns out. It would be interesting to do kind of a James Scott-esque analysis to how effectively people sweep the streets, right, on their community service days, how effectively they are patching potholes. But people show up to clean the streets and patch potholes, right? So I don't know that we have a really good way in Rwanda of getting variation on political participation, but I would be very concerned about people whose lived experiences with a conflict are excluded from a justice narrative, how they're going to interact with government and the state going forward. I don't think that we've answered the question about social cohesion. I think there's been some evidence from the Kachacha process that overall knowledge has increased. This matches on to Jim Gibson's work in South Africa that says that the TRC actually provided additional knowledge about what happened. We see this knowledge building component of Kachacha strongest among students and young people who were either not alive during the genocide or were quite young. They actually are learning things. I would then just add as a two-finger, what they're learning is the state-sponsored narrative about how the genocide took place, right? They're not necessarily learning a broader, more dynamic narrative about the conflict. But for that reason, I don't think we've answered the social cohesion piece, right? So Odette Nyirimilamo's original question, is this going to work? She was interested in these two final points. She was interested in whether or not it was going to bring reconciliation and more cohesively unite the society, and she was interested in patterns of future violence. What I did find, again in 2009, was higher levels of resentment and animosity towards the government among people who were excluded from the narrative, right? They were much more likely to speak predictably, right? To speak harshly about Kachacha, to speak harshly about some of the government programs. And I would just two-finger that any sort of hint of harsh language about the government should probably be thought of as actually much stronger than I was able to capture or record because of the way in which these narratives are talked about in Rwanda. I will just add as a caveat, because we were talking about some of Leanne Fuji's work, one of the methodological interventions that I was able to use, I wouldn't say innovation because I don't think it was actually that novel, when I was doing the interview work around these issues, was when you're asking people about conflict experience, people were very comfortable talking about experiences that they had had during the genocide because it was commensurate with the existing conflict narrative. People had a much harder time talking about violence that they experienced either during the genocide or during the Abichengazi period, because during the Abichengazi period, that violence would have been committed by the RPF state. One of the ways that I was able to get around that was by asking people about the time period in which they experienced different conflict violations. So people were perfectly willing to give a date to it, and then from there I was able to extrapolate, well, okay, if this happened in 1993, right, this didn't happen during the genocide. Or if this happened in 1996, this didn't happen during the genocide. And so it was in that way that we were able to have this kind of side door conversation about who the actual perpetrators of those crimes were without asking my interview respondents to say this was a violation that was committed at the hands of the RPF state. And so we were talking about kind of some of Leanne Fuji's methodology, and so I just wanted to add that as a way of thinking about how to triangulate some of these narratives that are difficult to get. So in conclusion, I think that the exclusionary nature of transitional justice, either in Rwanda or in other cases, is a real problem. I think we don't know how that impacts things like political participation, reconciliation, and social cohesion, but most important for me, cyclical patterns of violence going forward. Thank you. And for all the work that I previewed, all the working papers are up on my website, so I'm happy to share those with people as well.
So you cool handling your own questions up there?
Sure, sure.
Cool.
Do we?
I see Luke wants to start off.
Let me grab a notebook. If people are going to say brilliant and insightful things, I should write it down.
Cyanne, sorry. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. You made a point, you pointed out to a correlation between Kachacha activity and, if I understood it correctly, the density of the population of young unmarried Hutu men. How did you measure that? How could you tell that in that area, specific area, there were more men of that age category than elsewhere?
So, so we use both 1991 census data and then some current demographic data that's patchy to kind of string together how many people we think are living there.
Okay. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Cyanne, very cool stuff. Question though, so one, could you describe for people kind of like what type of information is available about Kachacha? And what kind of problems exist with that? But then secondly, I was curious about your, if exclusion leads to resentment, then doesn't that set up the then logical response from the Rwandan government, which was to basically continue to engage in repressive behavior so that resentment doesn't get a chance to mobilize?
Sure. Let me go in reverse. That may be an explanation for the ramp up of Kachacha, right? So that, and I don't know. Again, so we'd have to think about this, right? But the stepping up of Kachacha, right, can be potentially explained by the fact that people got more pissed off about the process, right, and you needed more repression. I don't know though. We have to be careful linking excluded Hutu narrative resentment exclusively to Kachacha, right? Because it's not. It's part of a broader kind of state-building strategy that's excluding those voices and those narratives. I also think that we're probably likely to find people in urban settings whose narrative is excluded but have been able in other ways to parlay some of the benefits of the current RPF state that aren't as resentful, right? So there's certainly going to be variation across that. The thing to me that was most striking was the ways in which many of these narratives were identical. Right, so you could have people that had the exact same conflict experience because of how much violence was going on there at the time. And this is exactly what your data finds, right? That the genocide wasn't just encapsulated by people who were killed for being Tutsi, right? There was an incredible amount of variation in that violence. And you can have the exact same experience, right? So you can have thugs that came to your house, that killed your parents, that burned down your property, that stole all your cows. And that just didn't happen during the genocide. And didn't happen because you were Tutsi. And so all of the recognition, the benefits, the moral support in some ways that comes from the RPF narrative, that comes from the Rwandan state narrative, wouldn't apply to you. And it was those people, particularly in the rural communities, that I found that really were still wrapping their head around it. Now, I'd also be careful. I'm not sure I would use the term, I don't know that everybody fell into the term resentment. So in using this heuristic about asking about dates, a lot of people weren't even comfortable calling what they had experienced a conflict experience. So there was no narrative with which to think about this. There was no organizing principle. People weren't talking about this in the markets, right? There wasn't a way to think about or construct it. So in some ways, the victim narrative gave people something to latch onto, right? If that's how they had experienced it, then they had words with which to process what they had experienced. A lot of these people, in some ways, it was the way that they discussed it was indistinct from like a car accident. So one of the individuals that I interviewed had actually lost a leg in a bombing during an RPF campaign that was designed again to root out kind of terrorist elements in the northwest. And he told people that it was a car accident, right? I mean, he didn't even want to be associated with that period of conflict because even though he was just a contextual casualty, right? The RPF wasn't targeting him. He didn't want people to think that he had been targeted for for potential engagement with, right, with the enemy, with the terrorists. And so it was interesting, right, the degree to which people weren't able to even reflect on what that experience was. They didn't have anything to call it. They lacked the words. And in Rwandan, they actually would say things like, we lacked the words, right? Like we don't have, like this isn't a thing. This, like your words are wrong. Your translation for this is wrong, right? They weren't willing to call it a conflict experience. All right, so Kachacha Day is an excellent question.
Before we switch.
Sorry.
So the kind of discussion in Kachacha process makes me think of, does anyone remember it was under Clinton and John Hope Franklin. They had this kind of like a conversation on like a national conversation on race that they had in the United States. And they went around to like different cities and they convened some like local notables from each location, and then they kind of go through this kind of programmatic discussion of like racial problems. If you look at the transcripts of each of those sessions, there's a moment at which the crowd just gets rowdy and then unleashes, and basically they cut it. They stopped going to the cities. They were just like, okay, we can't open up this can of worms. So what's interesting is how the space can release some things that are kind of intended and they go along with where you want to go, and then when you shut things down. And so in the U.S. context, they shut things down. In Rwanda, I'd be curious as to whether or not you think that there was some kind of could the Kachacha discussions even be regulated in the sense of given how it was structured?
So this is what's so interesting about Kachacha, right? And this is, and so we have to be careful about essentialized Kachacha narratives. So one, I don't think we have there's been nobody that's surveyed all of Kachacha courts, right? I don't know anybody that's actually done all that work. And we can talk about that as a data problem. But because there were so many different sites of Kachacha, there's huge variation. And so anybody would be disingenuous to say Kachacha always did this, right? It didn't. Beth Doherty has some great work in which she actually finds these sites of resistance. So she sits through some Kachacha hearings in which people say things like, well, wait a minute, he only got killed during the genocide because he hurt this family during the Civil War. And so then there was this this period in which people were willing and able to talk about Civil War crimes or Civil War violations, and some judges let that happen. And so the way in which each Kachacha unfolded has got to be a product of the judges' political affiliations, across time, because remember, these aren't static single-day events. So there's likely to be huge evolution in individual judges' ideologies. We can imagine judges getting called to Kigali for a re-education seminar in which they would then come back into communities and have a slightly different take or perspective. We can also think about different moments of the time, right? So did some prominent member of the community pass away, and so then the next Kachacha hearing had more space to reflect on his or her legacy because that's just where people were at that moment. There was definitely revenge violence around Kachacha, so we can think about that as either increasing or decreasing alternative narrative spaces that were allowed. So I mean, the real question is, I don't think we know. Now, the Katachi Archive has transcripts of many of these Kachacha processes. In theory, they have a transcript of every single Kachacha process. From what I've seen, they're a little patchy, and I don't know that I think we should have a reasonable expectation that a lot of the dissenting narratives would not appear in those transcripts, because those transcripts were very deliberately being sent back to headquarters in Kigali, right? So people knew that that's where they were ending up. But even within the ones that I read, there is discussion about variation, right, and different things that were talked about. So I don't think we know, right, what was actually talked about. In terms of whether or not the state ramped up or ramped down, we absolutely see a moment in Kachacha in which this lay judge thing isn't quite working. We end up with re-education campaigns, the imposition of politically appointed judges, right? That zeitgeist sort of shifts when it becomes clear that the smaller Kachacha courts or the preliminary Kachacha courts aren't as controllable as we would like them to be. And so I think, Christian, your narrative could be exactly right. We see this moment where kind of the lid is coming off. There's a lot of different things that have the potential to be brought up, and then it gets shut down very quickly. In the rewriting of the Kachacha laws, we also see the strengthening around the discussion of the narrative of the genocide become much clearer. This is what we're going to talk about. Now, legal pragmatists will tell you that this would be the same outcome if they were just watching the caseload get crazy and say, okay, no, we actually have to reduce down the scope. This is what we need to focus on, right? So there are alternative explanations for this. I am more sympathetic to the explanation that it was deviating from the counter narrative, but another way to talk about it is just if you've got the greatest crime known to man, right? You put together a process that works to prosecute this, right? And that bad stuff happens during civil wars all the time. Bad stuff happens during counterinsurgency campaigns all the time. That's not what we need to look at. We need to focus on this much greater atrocity. And maybe that's correct, right? Maybe that's what they should have been doing. Anyway, so there's an incredible amount of problems with the Kachacha data. I actually have pictures, if we want to dig them out over lunch, of the Kachacha Archive. When I was there in 2014, it's actually held within a police barracks. And so access to it is regulated. This was the safest place to put it, right? There was concerns that deviant elements would try to burn it down. There's all sorts of explanations as to why that is the case. But the Kachacha Archive is massive, and there are boxes and files from every single Kachacha case that ever took place. They're relatively open to the public. So certainly I was able to wade around in them and pull them off the shelves and read these boxes and see what's going on. They're in Rwandan. They need, so at least for me, they need to be translated. The problem is actually just the bulk of information. There's just so much there that your average researcher isn't going to be able to easily go through it. The Center for the Study of Genocide, the National Center for the Study of Genocide, Cyanne, and Kigali has actually compiled a database of all Kachacha cases. And this is what's carefully regulated by the government. So we know of one researcher in the United States who's been able to get access to it, and she got access to it signing a non-disclosure agreement. So she's allowed to analyze the data and publish those findings, but she's not actually allowed to release the replication data. This has all sorts of interesting implications, both for Rwanda scholars, but also for scientists that believe that data should be able to be replicated. But she has real clear reasons and has been able to convince editors in the venues that she's published that she is not able to publicly release this data. And so I think you've got two problems with the Kachacha data. So the one is that we can't get it. We can't get the easy to identify and easily accessible stuff. And then the other is just the sheer amount of it. So I'm horrible at distances, right? But the Kachacha Archive is floor to ceiling, taller than this. 10, 15 rows of documents, all in boxes. There's in my perspective, there's real concern about legacy issues because the roof kind of leaks and, I don't know that anybody's seriously taking care of these things. There's been international attempts to try to digitize it that have been unsuccessful, as far as I know. I hope that somebody eventually cracks that code. The ICTR was trying to do it at one point as part of their legacy efforts, but they didn't get very far with that. In my mind, one of the greatest losses of information is that the ICTR archive, when the ICTR shut down, actually got turned over to the Rwandan government. So it would have been nice to see that relocated to Tanzania or to The Hague or something like that, but it didn't. There's been a ton, and I think it sounds like Jens's book will track some of this. There's been a ton of really great research that's actually tracked, that it's looked at Kachacha at different time periods. I don't know we've squished all that together. So there's some interest. There are reports, right? So the Office of Reconciliation in Rwanda was writing reports and analyzing different stages of the Kachacha process. And so I don't know that anybody's compared those to see what the state was thinking at different time periods. I've got a bunch of those. Jens has got a bunch of those. This is your idea that we should get this all together and put it all up. The ICTR had almost all of those at one point. So I don't know where they all ended up. But that's the information on Kachacha. And then what we've been able to use, there was a public releasing of data that is now gone, but we caught that wave of public release of data in 2009 after the first kind of middle range of Kachacha courts before they really ramped up. So our article is actually, Luke, based on this original release of the Kachacha data, which is, as we've compared it to some of the other projects that have been done, we're missing a lot of the category 3 crimes, so we're missing the property crimes. But for us, we care less because we're actually interested in mapping onto conflict violence. So what we have is the category 1 and 2 crimes. Can you tell me who you are?
Yes, I'm Peter Carroll. I'm a graduate student here in the department.
In political science?
In political science, yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the exclusionary justice dynamics. So specifically like social cohesion, and whether in your interviews you're able to draw out how people think about the outcomes of these. I mean, whether or not they were able to hear their grievances or in the community, and whether they think that's the state hearing them or the community hearing them, and whether they perhaps get jealous of those that did get a ruling in their favor. I mean, I'm just interested in like these social dynamics that emerge and how much they perceive that as being like connected to the state versus their community.
Yeah. Have you done any work in Rwanda?
Yeah, a little.
All right, so I would describe it as kind of the Rwanda flatline, right? So, so no, right? You don't actually hear a lot of intense resentment. What I heard most of was this kind of flatline, this doesn't apply to me, my experiences don't matter, right? And an acceptance of the fact that what people had experienced were outside of this. So to the extent that people would acknowledge their experiences, you kind of got this flat line. Many people that I interviewed had no words to articulate those experiences, right? So didn't see it as exclusion, right? That exclusionary label is something that I'm putting on it. It wasn't something that they were able to articulate themselves. And I heard less discussion about community exclusion and more about state. So people were really concerned about access to some of these state resources. Particularly when I was doing research in 2009, there was a bunch of programs that were being rolled out for genocide survivors. This is when, this is right kind of in the ramp up to the presidential election, and there was an attempt to really consolidate the RPF base. This was done through a lot of kind of patronage activities and a real focus on at least visibly looking like they were supporting survivors, though there's a decent amount of counter-narrative about whether or not the RPF was truly interested in advancing the fate of survivors. I'm not the best to speak on that, but there's a lot of work that's being done now thinking about the RPF's relationship to the victim community. And so people saw these programs, and I think that's what people responded to most, because you would end up, if you were able to take advantage of some of the survivor fund money, with the ability to have a new house. Particularly as TIJ got ramped up, then you could have ex-combatants and ex-prisoners actually building that new house for you, right? And particularly around the issue of school fees. So genocide survivors and their children who were able to tap into resources that paid for school fees that other people weren't eligible to get. This is before primary education became universalized. And so those were the type of things that people were most concerned about. In terms of kind of social cohesion and things going forward, it's really difficult to leverage in Rwanda, because if you ask people, do you show up for your community service obligations? Do you vote? Do you, yeah, I mean, everyone says yes, and they do, right? The numbers support that. And I actually, those are some of the numbers from the Rwandan government that I believe, right? I think voter turnout actually is that high. And I even think probably the vote results are correct. The conspiracy theories that I've heard have actually talked about adjusting the vote records in the other direction. Right, so when Kagame gets 98% of the vote, he actually takes it down to 92 because 98 just looks ridiculous. So I often believe conspiracy theorists in that direction, right? And we can talk about whether or not this is just kind of cultural legacies in Rwanda about authoritarian rule and kind of how that works. I mean, Strauss makes that argument at some point. I think Jens will talk a little bit about that in his talk. So I'm not sure that if we're interested in testing those implications about social cohesion and political participation, Rwanda is even the best site for it. What we need to then start worrying about is, as the government does start to open up, then what do we see? Right? So at a particular moment in time, and we might actually be closer to it than we think we are, but a super strong Rwandan state is going to be able to maintain the level of control that it can. It's a relatively small country. They have a very powerful military. Right? The repressive apparatus in Rwanda is good. And so we'll continue to see a Rwanda the way that we know it to be functioning today. There are other places, perhaps, where an exclusionary narrative in transitional justice may be more threatening because the state isn't able to as effectively kind of consolidate those narratives and deal with issues of resentment and political participation and social cohesion. And again, you don't have to care about these things, right? So again, the counter narrative in Rwanda would say, look, we're an incredibly violent society. We've had this really massive event of violence, and this is what we need to do right now. And I bought that argument more 15 years ago than I buy it now, right? So I think that was an easier to swallow argument 5, 10 years after the genocide than it is 25 years after the genocide, right? Because now the question is, all right, well, when actually are you consolidated enough to release some of these political pressures?
Yeah, for your information about the Kachacha archives, I happen to be this week in contact with two insiders, one from the Netherlands Institute for War Crimes and Genocide Studies, an institution that is involved with the conservation of the archives, and then the person on the ground of King's College London. They too are involved with the digitization of the archives. So the two sources confirm me that all 60 or 63 million Kachacha pages have been, one source says scanned, the other source says digitized. I'm not sure what the difference is, but the person on the ground in Kigali said he forwarded my question for access to the digitized archive to Jean-Damascene Gazanabo, the director.
Who is the co-author with Holly on these Kachacha papers?
Yes, and the response I got back was from, I presume, Gazanabo, that researchers will not have access to the digital archive, only the physical archive in Kigali, and he invited me to request permission from him to browse, to go through the archive in Kigali. But as you maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but in African arguments there was this anonymous contribution. Are you aware of it?
I am.
Of a researcher complaining that if you want to go visit and research the physical archive, there are so many obstacles, and that is screening. That was to find out what you might be looking for and whether you would be critical or not. And if there's a chance you will be critical, then you will be stonewalled and you will never get. You will not be rejected. You will never get an answer. Yeah.
So I mean, my permit to use the Kachacha archives is still valid, right? So my problem is not access. It's not physical access. So two things. You go through security clearance to get onto a police barracks, right? So the state is very clear about. You're not wandering into a library, right? This is not housed in a university, right? You are checked and patted down by police. Probably, again, rightly so for entering a police barracks, less so for entering the Kachacha archives, right? To then get into the Kachacha archives. There's just so much stuff, right? So it's a needle in a haystack. You'd never find your one deviant story. You'd never find your opposition. You'd never. I mean, they're right to let you have it because there's nothing to do with it, right? And I would. The people that I've found who've been most successful in the Kachacha archives are individuals who are researching single communities or a single Kachacha court. And then you go to your box. You've got the files from your box, right? You can read those cases. You can think about that. But as I mentioned, right, there's so much variation across Kachacha. You'd never be able to capture that with the Kachacha archives because systematic evaluation of the processes are exactly what's being blocked. And I don't even know. Again, there's huge variation across the research community in Rwanda about whether or not, I don't know that people are always intentionally blocking. I think that many researchers say, yeah, but you can have access to the archive, right? Like go and do whatever project you want to do. You have access to the archive, right? It just, I mean, I don't know, I spent more than a week there, and I got some cool stuff. They have a lot, for me, the most interesting things that they have on file was a lot of the videos. So they have film evidence of a lot of the cases, including re-education campaigns that they did in Congo before Kachacha started. So they actually wander around and talk to people, some of the refugee camps and then mostly in some settlements outside the refugee camps, and say, look, we're doing Kachacha, like you should come back. And man, talk about some of, these are exactly the narratives that the RPF talk about. Huge amounts of resistance and pushback, you're just trying to kill us, right? These really anti-Rwandan state, these are state dissidents, right? These are people who are actively opposed to the Rwandan state, perfectly captured on video, right? Saying pretty horrible things about the Rwandan government. But interesting to know that that there was a real genuine attempt at the beginning to try to convince people to come back and participate in Kachacha. So, and they've got, so there are these like nuggets of really interesting, cool stuff there. But yeah, I mean, for an anthropologist, not for a political scientist, or at least I would struggle using the methodologies that I use to systematically analyze that data. But we should all go visit the archive. It's totally worth doing.
Thanks, Cyanne. This is a fascinating material and presentation, and I completely buy the argument you and Christian are working on. And I have many more questions, but one maybe for now. You mentioned in passing that in 2014, you talked to a bunch of RPF elites, insiders who were involved early on in the construction of Kachacha. I'm interested in this, as the rest of you will find out in a few moments, because that's what I focused on in 2002. So I'm just curious, who at that point in time self-identified or was identified by others as having been involved in the making of Kachacha early on?
Am I allowed to say I'll talk to you about that off the record?
Yes.
So I'm happy to give you the list of people that I interviewed, and we can talk about that. And everybody that I talked to was happy to be interviewed on the record, but I'm not sure that they would be happy to be interviewed on the internet.
Yeah. The reason, even without knowing the names for the rest of you, is interesting because at that point in time, the regime had become considerably more violent internally as well, in terms of how to cleanse the RPF and get rid of dissidents. And 2014, it was a very, very different regime by that point in time. So it's interesting then, just sort of that, who would go on the record and why would they do this? Because very early on, people were quite reluctant. It took a lot of persuasion, because that early on, RPF elites, like including Mucho and others, were reluctant to even say what they really did, because at that point in time, nobody quite knew what Kachacha would become. There was still an element of hope, but there were also reservations. Gahima and others wanted a more legal response rather than sort of this response that they thought would be softer, which it ended up not being at all. But so it's interesting in 2014, in that atmosphere, who would put his name or her name to this
But
project?
I think it is exactly that atmosphere that allowed for those interviews. And it's because the RPF had gotten so strong and was cleansing so quickly that if you considered yourself to be core RPF, you considered yourself to be safer from that cleanse, right? So you had you had reason to believe that you were safe because you had that you had watched what that attrition looked like. And so the people that I talked to were core RPF that had come across the border from Uganda, and so I think believed themselves to be in an inner cadre. And some of them continue to be, and some of them are no longer, right? So there's variation across that, but that's what I attribute it to. I didn't. The timing of that project was not intentional on my part, right? So I went in 2014 because I was in Uganda doing other stuff, right? And so kind of hopped across the border to do some follow-up interviews, and was shocked at the level of information I got that was different from interviews I'd done in 2009, 2010, and other periods. So that's what I attribute it to. Right, that it, yeah, and it was, and again, it was also this period, maybe because of that attrition, or maybe just because of age, people were kind of reflecting on the original project. So there was discussion about, in 1994, some of the RPF human rights campaigns and attempts by the RPF to document human rights violations, and so people were kind of thinking back to what they had done and what they were trying to do, and anyway, it was all part of that broader discussion.
So I'm imagining this is more of a continuing discussion rather than you're stopping now and Jens is beginning. But
I'm anxiously looking forward to what Jens has to say, so we'll switch it over.
good. Thank you.